of these efforts, basically. And the approach is very simple, right? You define potential determinants of the current account balance. Here's a whole list. We'll go back into that later on. And then you run a regression where you regress the current account balance that you observe in country I at time t on cyclical and structural / fundamental determinants and policy-related determinants, and you get these estimates. Then you define desirable levels of the policy-related variables. That is the black box part of the whole thing. So IMF has been bullying Germany for decades, saying, you spend too little money. In fact, I guess we did, because we should have spent more on infrastructure, but that's another page. Now, finally, we compute current account norms and current account gaps. Now, the current account norms are the fundamentals and cyclical factors times the estimated coefficients plus the policy variables at the desirable level times the estimated coefficients. And the current account gap is the mix of a policy gap and the regression residual. Okay? Now, what I want to do with you in the exercise is eventually estimate this regression. And the nice thing is the IMF gives us all the information that we need. It gives us the data set, it gives us the do file and stata, and we just have to understand what the do file does, essentially, and I'll walk you through the do file. Okay. But before doing that, let me just show you how to read these entries. Now, this is Thailand in 2023. And, right, this is there's a big table with a lot of countries. Now, let's just look at Thailand. So the actual current account balance of Thailand in the year 2023 was 1.4% of GDP. Now, the cyclically adjusted current account balance was 1.3. Now, how do you do the cyclical adjustment? Well, you subtract the product of observed cyclical factors and their estimated coefficients. Now, cyclical factors are, for example, the output gap. Now, what the IMF consistently finds, and I brought this up on the second day, is that the output gap has a negative effect on the current account balance. From the intertemporal approach, this is the challenge, because you would argue that a positive output gap signaling good times induces people to save more, and so that should drive up the current account. But I gave you an example how we could rationalize this by, for example, invoking permanent productivity shocks. Now, be it as it may, right, these are the cyclical factors like the output gap, the commodity terms of trade, and the real effective exchange, the change of the real effective exchange rate. And you do the cyclical adjustment by just saying, okay, we have a certain output gap for Thailand. We have a certain commodity terms of trade interacting with trade openness level for Thailand. We have these variables, and we multiply them with their estimated coefficients, like the minus 0.279, 0.291, and so on and so forth. And we subtract that from the observed Thai current account balance. And this is and what the bottom line is that under normal times, Thailand would have had a slightly smaller current account balance, right? So cyclical factors drove up the Thai current account balance a little bit. If we net them out, then we get to the 1.3. Now, the EBA norm, the current account norm for Thailand, given its structural factors and the desired policy variables, would have been 0.8%. Now, from that perspective, the first take would be, oh, in the year 2023, the Thai current account balance was 0.5 percentage points too high. It should have had and that's the current account gap. Now, Thailand is a special case because Thailand still suffered in 2023 from the kind of the long-time effects of the COVID pandemic. And so what the IMF does here is it does certain adjustments, and these adjustments say, look, given that Thailand was hit very hard by COVID, the current account balance, and it was not away in 2023, the current account balance should have been even lower. So the 1.3 is actually, the 1.3 is way too high given what we would have expected, given Thailand's long-run suffering from the COVID pandemic. You know, and what I have in mind is the tourism, the breakdown of tourism. So this is the 2.1 thing, and so this adds to the EBA current account gap and makes the current account gap even higher. So to make a long story short, the assessment of the IMF for Thailand is, well, in the year 2023, the Thai cyclically adjusted current account balance was at 1.3%. Based on fundamentals, but also the long run effects of COVID, we would have expected a current account deficit of minus 1.3%, and the gap is 2.6%. Now, when you look at the table in this thing, you see that Thailand is one of the few countries where this adjustment is made. For other countries, there's no adjustment, right? So for Korea, for example, there's no such adjustment, and so the EBA gap is the EBA gap. So for example, when you look at Korea, where is Korea? Korea had a current account balance of 2.1% of GDP. Cyclical adjustment would have raised it slightly. So under kind of normal circumstances, so for example, if the output gap had been at 0, the current account balance in Korea would have been at 2.3%. The current account norm, so given the fundamental factors and the policy variables at their desirable levels, the current account balance should have been at 4.4%. So the actual current account balance was, there's a rounding error here, there should have been slightly 2% lower. But differently, the observed current account balance was 2 percentage point below what it would have been expected to be, right? And then let me take another country. Let me take Germany. Germany in 2023 had a current account surplus of 5.9%. Cyclical adjustment didn't change anything. The EBA current account norm is 3.1%. indicating that the current account gap was 2.7%. Again, of course, 5.9 minus 3.1 is 2.8, not 2.7, but that's, again, a rounding thing. And so this, you get all these assessments. You get, for example, when you take Japan, the current account balance was almost exactly where we would expect it. Now, what are the economic policy implications? Well, the IMF says there's alarm bells ringing whenever you are too far above or too far below the current account norm. When the current account gap in the absolute value is too high, then there's a signal of something being kind of weird, right? So now there's a lot of things that you can say about that approach. I would say that the biggest problem is, how do you interpret a regression residual? Now the IMF says when the residual is high, this indicates that something weird is going on. Now, what you learned in econometrics is when residuals are high, your model is not very good. And this is the constant, you know, when these IMF missions say, come to whatever, be it to Germany, right? And tell the German policymakers, Bundesbank people, statistical authorities, look, your finance ministry, look, your current account balance is too high, then Germans say, maybe your model is just not very good. And this is where the residual comes from. And you do not account for everything that's driving the current account. And this is something that's very hard to resolve, right? But at least this is a basis for discussion. And I think I love that, well, love is maybe exaggerated, but I like this EVA approach because it's so straightforward, right? It is, and it's very transparent, except for these policy variables, these policy goals. And also these adjustments, right? The adjustments in the last columns. This is something sometimes really black boxish, but it's at least the IMF. I mean, some say 20 years ago the IMF showed at respective countries, probably also in Vietnam, and said, look, we think your current account balance is too low or it's too high. You should do something about it. And then people said, how do you know? And then the IMF said, well, we have experts. And then people said, yeah, we also have experts. And then this was not a very productive discussion. Here you can argue, yeah, we think that there's something that your model is missing about our country. So if ever you work in a central bank, the State Bank of Vietnam, for example, you will be confronted with that. Maybe the next vintage of it. But it's something that is evolving, and it's something that this policy institution is doing, and I think it's very useful. Why? Well, because the historical lesson was that maybe in the just in the wake or just before the global financial crisis, there were excessive currency surpluses and currency deficit, current account surpluses and current account deficits. And some people held that responsible for the global financial crisis. There was an excessive current account deficit in the United States. There was an excessive current account surplus in countries like China and Germany. And if people had been aware of that earlier on, then maybe the global financial crisis wouldn't have been so tough. I'm not sure this is really a good interpretation of what drove the global financial crisis of 2008-9, but I see that there's the general challenge of trying to having a well-founded and well-reasoned argument on or normative assessment of current account balances. Now, let me go into the problem set. Well, let me first show you the. This is the extent. Oops, where is it? Here it is. This is the. Nope. This is the external sector report, right? You have that. You know, you have all these executive summaries, and then you have text, and then you have lots of graphics, some of which I've copied and pasted. Look, this, for example, is a thing that appears in my presentation. And where am I going? This is also something I have in my presentation. This is stronger than implied by fundamentals. So, for example, Singapore currently has a current account balance that is higher than what would be implied by fundamentals. So, being excessive. Stronger and weaker, I don't know whether that's a good term, right? We're talking about surpluses and deficits. Is a deficit a weakness? I don't know. You see that, for example, South Africa recently has turned green in terms of, broadly in line. So has China, according to the IMF. So has the euro area as a whole. Belgium is a country that is weaker, so the current account deficit is too large. according to the IMF. Same thing for Argentina, same thing for Turkey, same thing for the United Kingdom. And you see that, for example, two other countries that have current account balances that are assessed to be too high by the IMF is Sweden and the Netherlands. Germany moving from dark blue to bright blue, so things are not as excessive as they used to be. Alrighty. Then next thing is I want to show you this. There's this document here, which you can download. And this gives you the EBA estimates, analysis of 2023 current accounts and real effective exchange rates. And if you go to page 10, that's what you get, right? This is the regression output. This is the stuff that I've copied and pasted into my presentation. That's exactly what we're going to do on the final 100 meters of this session today, right? Okay. Now let me go into the problem set. And so here's the external sector report. Sometimes I call it the external stability report, which is not correct. Now, a first look at the data. The IMF's 2024 EBA dataset is given in the file EBA 2024 CA dataset XLSX. This file has been downloaded from the following website. Here it is. Variable definitions are given in the worksheet variables. Note that many variables are measured relative to or as deviations from the cross-country average. Why is that? Well, let me give you the answer. I gave it this morning. If one country has an old age dependency ratio of 80% and all the other countries have old age dependency ratios of 20%, then the one country sticks out. And you should expect a certain effect. If all countries have old age dependency ratios of 80%, then the one country is not a big exception, right? And you shouldn't see a small effect. Same thing for the budget balance. Same thing for most other variables. It's always, current account balances are things between countries, right? And if all countries are the same, current account balances are driven by asymmetries. For example, you have a country with a low old age dependency ratio having a higher current account balance than a country with a low old age dependency ratio. But it's always about differences between countries. Secondly, I have corrected an obvious mistake in the variable description. Nobody has noticed. So they keep publishing this data, but they do not correct that mistake. Maybe I should write them an email. I'll show you in a second. And I've added a set of regional dummies not included in the original IMF data set. So let me open the data set in Excel. Oops, no, where is it? Problem sets. This is the data set. And let me start at the last. Arbeitung aktivieren. Okay, so be it. This is the last page, right? And this should not be this variable is not the instrumented foreign exchange interventions interacted with capital controls, but it's the instrumented fiscal balance. And this is not the instrumented fiscal balance, but the other way around. And as I said, there's probably thousands of people using this data, and nobody has ever noticed or informed the IMF. Okay, funny. This is the data, right? And this is a panel data set. And the panel data set, well, actually, here's the panel data set. This is the better way of showing it. What does a panel data set look like? Well, a panel data set, did you do some panel data econometrics?
Once.
But that's at least once. Okay, what is a panel data set? Well, for a panel data set, you have a cross-section dimension and you have a time series dimension. So you have the same cross-sectional unit observed at different points in time. So the way a panel data set is structured is this way. You have the first country, the United States, for the first year, 1986, and then it goes all the way down to 2019. Right? And then you have the next country, the United Kingdom, starting in 1986 and going all the way down to 2019. Okay? And then all those columns reflect data points, right? So this is the current account balance relative to GDP. Now, what I hate is that the IMF gives those variables names that are pretty opaque, very hard to read, right? So you have to go to the last thing, to the last sheet to know what that means. You have to go to the last sheet to know what that means. Yeah, they could have given it nicer, more easy to read names. But by the end of the day, that's the way it is. What I've added is I have an East Asia and Pacific dummy. I have a Europe and Central Asia dummy. I have a Latin America and Caribbean dummy. I have a Middle East and North Africa dummy. I have a North America dummy. And I've got a South Asia dummy. And I've got a Sub-Saharan Africa dummy and a Western Europe dummy. Right? So this is something that you don't get in the EBA data set for reasons that I will explain later on. Okay? So if you ever work with a panel data set, then the first thing is, of course, to put together the data. And this is the way that a panel data set looks like, the so-called stacked format. Stacked meaning you have all the years for the first observation, then you have all the years for the second observation, then you have all the years. By the end of the day, you have n times t observations, n observational units, capital T, points in time. Now this is a so-called balanced panel because you have, for every country, you have the full range of years covered. I think so. To be frank, I don't really know. Maybe because some countries didn't exist in 1986. Maybe, I guess this is not balanced. Good. Right. So you can import the data set into Stata by clicking on File, Import Excel Spreadsheet. Right. So let's do that. File. Where's import? Here. I hate that. I should have brought the mouse. File, import, Excel spreadsheet. So where's the Excel file? Well, here it is. Nope, that's not what I want. I want to rename it. Now this is all in and I want to, the first, wait a minute. I want to have the worksheet CA data set and want to have the first row should be variable names, right? That tells Excel, that tells Stata, look, the first row is just the variable names. Okay, here it is. And you see, well, we have this stuff on the right-hand side, and there's a nice thing in Stata which is called the data editor, and you can look at it and you see that's exactly the data set that we just had. This is really fat here. Let me make it a bit smaller. Okay, so you have, basically you have that, the data set going from the United States in 1986 to scroll. You see there's gaps and holes in it, so there's actually, that's an unbalanced panel. So for example, you didn't have data for Romania. You didn't have data for Romania on the net for an asset position prior to 1991. Because I think Mr. Ceausescu was not interested in sharing this information with the rest of the world. Good. Okay, now let's do some simple stuff on just looking at the data, just to get you a bit familiar with that. So how do you plot the evolution of Switzerland's current account balance relative to GDP between 1986 and 2019? So the nice thing about Stata is it is, well, or let me put it differently. What is bad about Stata? What's bad about Stata is that you have these commands, right? There's another program called eViews. Does anyone know eViews as a econometrics package? Now eViews is like, eViews is to Stata what Word is to Tech, right? So eViews, or maybe R is even more like Tech. So eViews is, what you see is what you get. You click on things, and Stata is you have to type in commands. That's the difference. Now the nice thing about Stata is that there is this Stata community. And once in a while there's a new edition of Stata, but in between there's people writing new commands in Stata, which you can just download free of charge. So Stata is constantly evolving. This is not, right, this is not a sales event for Stata. It just says Stata is quite practical. So if you do that, then you get a picture. So you see that this is the evolution of Switzerland's current account balance between 1986 and 2019. And you see that by and large, Switzerland had very high current account surpluses. It had a drop in 2008 when the financial crisis hit. This is when primary income turned heavily negative, by the way, and this is what dragged down the current account balance. What's nice here is you also see this is not in percentage terms, right? This is 0.05, which means 5% of GDP. Now, this is a pretty nerdy remark, but always be aware of the scaling of your variables. Sometimes I see people run regressions where they have a variable in whatever, which is between 0 and 1 on the left-hand side, and then they have GDP on the right-hand side, and they get coefficients which are 0.0000. But they're significant nevertheless. Now, when I see that, then I say, look, folks, why don't you just divide by 1 million or 1 billion or take logs or whatever, just to, taking logs is another thing. But you shouldn't be, because people say, oh, there's no effect. But that's just because of the scaling of the variables, because you have something between 0 and 1 on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side you have something that goes from 0 to whatever, 174,000. And so that the scaling is important. That's not a big thing, right? I'm not super proud of making that point, but that's something that you should be aware of. Good, so let's close that. So how was Germany's average current account balance relative to GDP between average, right? So how can I make that smaller again? I'm gonna make that smaller again. Okay, that's not what I want to do. My touchpad is getting really aggressive. Now let me go to Ansicht. And let me say I want the normal view. Okay, so SU means, or SU means summarize. So you summarize